Hello and welcome. My name is Alan. Grab you a drink, pull you a chair up. We are going to be reading more. A Testament of Hope, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we are starting a new piece today called Why We Can't Wait. So let's go ahead and just hop right into this. The blurb reads, after the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy on the 22nd of November 1963, King declared in Why We Can't Wait that we were all involved in the death of John Kennedy. He tolerated hate. We tolerated the sick stimulation of violence in all walks of life, and the integrated, and we tolerated the different application of law, which said that a man's life was sacred only if we agreed with his views. This may explain the cascading grief that flooded the country in late November. We mourned a man who had become the pride of the nation. But we grieved as well for ourselves because we knew we were sick. SCLC's successful campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, and the successful nationally televised 28th of August March on Washington seemed to be eclipsed by the hideous murder of four little black girls as they attended the Sunday school of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which was bombed in September, as well as by the shocking assassination of the president. Dr. King's message of nonviolence sounded like the voice of a lonely prophet crying in a wilderness of hate and violence. Why We Can't Wait was an attempt to defend the potency of nonviolence direct action by showing how it had succeeded in Birmingham and other southern cities. Chapter 1, The Negro Revolution. The bitterly cold winter of 1962 lingered throughout the opening months of 1963, touching the land with chill and frost, and then was replaced by a placid spring. Americans awaited the quiet summer that is would be pleasant, they had no doubt. The worst of the worst be the nightmare created by 60 million cars, all apparently trying to reach the same destination at the same time. 50 million families look forward to the pleasure of 200 million vacations in the American tradition of the frenetic hunt for relaxation. It would be a pleasant summer because, in the mind of the average man, there was little cause for concern. The blithe outlook about the state of the nation was reflected from as high as the White House. The administration confidently readied a tax reduction bill. Business and employment were at comfortable levels. Money was, for many Americans, plentiful. Summer came and the weather was beautiful, but the climate was but the social climate of American life erupted into lightning flashes, trembled with thunder, and vibrated to the relentless growing rain of protest come to life through the land. America's third revolution, the Negro Revolution, had begun. For the first time in a long time, for a long and turbulent history of the nation, almost 1,000 cities were engulfed in civil turmoil, the violence trembling just below the surface. Reminiscent of the French Revolution of 1789, the streets had become a battleground, just as they had become the battleground in the 1830s of England's tumultuous Chartist movement. As in these two revolutions, a submerged social group, propelled by a burning need for justice, lifting itself with sudden swiftness, moving with determination and a majestic scorn for risk and anger, created an uprising so powerful that it shook a huge society from its comfortable base. Never in American history had a group seized the streets, the squares, the sacrosanct businesses, thoroughfares, and the marbled halls of government in protest and proclaim the unendurability of their oppression. Had room-sized machines turned human burst from the plants that housed them and talked, stalked the land in revolt, the nation could not have been more amazed. Undeniably, the Negro had been an object of sympathy and wore the scars of deep grievances, but the nation had come to count on him as a creature who could quietly endure, silently suffer, and patiently wait. He was well trained in service, and whatever the provocation, he neither pushed back nor spoke back. Just as lightning makes no sound until it strikes, the Negro Revolution generated quietly, but when it struck, the revealing flash of its power and the impact of its sincerity and fervor displayed a force of a frightening intensity. 300 years of humiliation, abuse, and deprivation cannot be expected to find voice in a whisper. The storm clouds did not release a gentle rain from heaven, but a whirlwind which has not yet spent its force, nor attained its full momentum. Because there is more to come, because American society is bewildered by the spectacle of the Negro in revolt, because the dimensions are vast and the implications deep in a nation with 20 million Negroes. It is important to understand the history that is being made today. Some years ago, I sat in a Harlem department store surrounded by hundreds of people. I was autographing copies of Stride Toward Freedom, my book about the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56. As I signed my name to a page, I felt something sharp plunge forcefully into my chest. I had been stabbed with a letter opener, struck home by a woman who would later be judged insane, rushed by ambulance to Harlem Hospital. I lay in bed for hours while preparations were made to remove the keen-edged knife from my body. Days later, when I was well enough to talk with Dr. Aubrey Maynard, the chief of surgeons who performed the delicate, dangerous operation, I learned the reason for the long delay that preceded surgery. He told me that the razor tip of the instrument had been touching my aorta and that my whole chest had to be opened to extract it. If you had sneered during all these if you had sneezed during all those hours of waiting, Dr. Maynard said, your aorta would have been punctured and you would have drowned in your own blood. In the summer of 1963, the knife of violence was just that close to the nation's aorta. Hundreds of cities might now be mourning countless dead, but for the operation of certain forces which gave political surgeons an opportunity to cut boldly and safely to remove the deadly peril. What was it that gave the second chance? To answer this, we must answer another question. Why did the revolution occur in 1963? Negroes had for decades endured evil. In the words of the poet, they had long asked, why must the blackness of nighttime collect in our mouth? Why must we always taste the grief in our blood? Any time would seem to have been the right time. Why 1963? Why did 1,000 cities shudder almost simultaneously? And why did the whole world, in gleaming capitals and mud hut villages, hold its breath during those months? Why was it this year that the American Negro uh, so long ignored, so long written out of the pages of history books, tramped a declaration of freedom with his marching feet across the pages of newspapers and television screens and the magazines? Sarah Turner closed the kitchen cupboard and went into the streets. John Wilkins shut down the elevator and enlisted in the nonviolent army. Bill Griggs slammed the brakes of his truck and slid to the sidewalk. And Reverend Arthur Jones led his flock into the streets and held church in jail. The words and actions of parliaments, of statesmen, of kings and prime ministers, movie stars and athletes were shifted from the front pages to make room for the history-making deeds of the servants, the drivers, the elevator operators, the ministers. Why in 1963, and what has this to do with the dark thread of violence? And why did the dark thread of violence not erupt in blood? The Negro had become deeply disappointed over the slow pace of school desegregation. He knew that in 1954 the highest court in the land had handed down a decree calling for desegregation of schools with all deliberate speed. He knew that this edict from the Supreme Court had been heeded with all deliberate delay. At the beginning of 1963, 9 years after the historic decision, approximately 9% of Southern Negro students were attending integrated schools. At this pace, if this pace were maintained, it would be the year 2054 before integration in Southern schools would be a reality. In its wording, the Supreme Court decision had revealed an awareness that attempts would be made to evade its intent. The phrase all deliberate speed did not mean that another century should be allowed to unfold before we released Negro children from the narrow pigeonhole of the segregated schools. It meant that giving some courtesy and consideration to the need for softening old attitudes and outdated customs, democracy must press ahead out of the past of ignorance and intolerance and into the present of educational opportunity and moral freedom. Yet the statistics made it abundantly clear that the segregationists of the South remained undefeated by the decision. From every section of Dixie, the announcement of the High Court had been met with declarations of defiance. Once recovered from their initial outrage, these defenders of the status quo had seized the offensive to impose their own schedule of change. The progress that had been supposed to have been achieved with deliberate speed had created change for less than 2% of Negro children in the most areas of the South, and not even 1/10 of 1% in some areas of the deepest South. There was another factor in the slow pace of progress, a factor of which few are aware and even fewer understand. It is an unadvertised fact that soon after the 1954 decision, the Supreme Court retreated from its own position by giving approval to the pupil placement law. This law permitted the states themselves to determine where school children might be placed by virtue of family background, special ability, or other subjective criteria. The pupil placement law was also as far reaching in modifying and limiting the integration of schools as the original decision had been in attempting to eliminate segregation. Without technically reversing itself, the court had granted legal sanction to tokenism and thereby guaranteed that segregation in substance would last for an indefinite period, though formally it was illegal. In order, then, to understand the deep disillusion of the Negro in 1963, one must examine his contrasting emotions at the time of the decision and during the 9 years that had followed. One must understand the pendulum swing in between the elation that arose when the verdict was handed down and the despair that followed the failure to bring it to light. The second reason for the outburst in 1963 was rooted in disappointment with both political parties. From the city of Los Angeles in 1960, the Democratic Party had written an historic and sweeping civil rights pronouncement into its campaign platform. The Democratic standard bearer had repeated eloquently and often that the moral weight of the presidency must be applied to this burning issue. From Chicago, the Republican Party had been generous in its convention vows on civil rights, although its candidate had made no great effort in his campaign to convince the nation that he would redeem his party's promises. Then 1961 and 62 arrived, with both parties working or marking time in the cause of justice. In Congress, reactionary Republicans were still doing business with the Dixiecrats, and the feeling was growing among Negroes that the administration had oversimplified and underestimated the civil rights issue. President Kennedy, if not backing down, had backed away with a key pledge of his campaign to wipe out housing discrimination immediately with the stroke of a pen. When he had finally signed the housing order 2 years after taking office, its terms, though praiseworthy, had revealed a serious weakness in its failure to attack the key problem of discrimination in financing by banks and other institutions. While Negroes were being appointed to some significant jobs and social hospitality was being extended at the White House to Negro leaders, the dreams of the masses remained in tatters. The Negro felt that he recognized the same old bone that had been tossed to him in the past, only now it had been handed to him on a platter with courtesy. The administration had fashioned its primary approach to discrimination in the South around a series of lawsuits chiefly designed to protect the right to vote. Opposition toward action on other fronts had been sometimes privately had begun to harden. With each new Negro protest, we were advised, sometimes privately and sometimes in public, to call off our efforts and channel all of our energies into registering voters. On the occasion, we would agree with the importance of voting rights, but would patiently seek to explain that Negroes did not want to neglect all other rights while one was selected for concentrated attention. It was necessary to conclude that our argument was not persuading the administration any more than the government's logic was prevailing with us. Negroes had manifested their faith by racking up a substantial majority for their votes for President Kennedy. They had expected more of him than of the previous administration. In no sense had President Kennedy betrayed his promises, yet his administration appeared to believe it was doing as much as was politically possible and had, by its uh, positive deeds, earned enough credit to coast on civil rights. Politically, perhaps, this was not a surprising conclusion. How many people understood during the first 2 years of the Kennedy administration that the Negroes now was becoming as militant as the segregationists? Never. Eventually, the president would set political considerations aside and rise to the level of his own unswerving moral commitment. But this was still in the future. No discussion of the influences that bore on the thinking of the Negro in 1963 would be complete without some attention to the relationship of this revolution to international events. Throughout the upheaval of the Cold War politics, Negroes had seen their government go to the brink of nuclear conflict more than once. The justification for risking the annihilation of the human race was always expressed in terms of America's willingness to go to any lengths to preserve freedom. To the Negro, that readiness for heroic measures in the defense of liberty disappeared or became tragically weak when the threat was within our own borders and was concerned with the Negro's liberty, while the Negro is not so selfish as to stand isolated in his concern for his own dilemma, ignoring the ebb and flow of events around the world. There is a certain bitter irony in the picture of this country champion freedom in foreign lands and failing to ensure that freedom to 20 million of its own. From beyond the borders of his own land, the Negro had been inspired by another powerful force. He had watched the decolonization and liberation of nations in Africa and Asia since World War II. He knew that yellow, black, and brown people had felt for years that the American Negro was too passive, unwilling to take strong measures to gain his freedom. He might have remembered the visit of this country of an African head of state who was called upon by the delegates of prominent American Negroes. When they began reciting to him their long list of grievances, the visiting statesman had waved a weary hand and said, "I am aware of current events. I know everything you are telling me about what the white man is doing to the Negro. Now tell me, what is the Negro doing for himself? The American Negro saw in the land from which he had been snatched and thrown into slavery a great pageant of political progress. He realized that just 30 years ago there were only 3 independent nations in the whole of Africa. He knew that by 1963 more than 34 African nations had risen from colonial bondage. The Negro saw black statesmen voting on vital issues, in the United Nations, and knew that in many cities of his own land he had not been permitted to take that significant walk to the ballot box. He saw the black kings and potentates ruling from palaces, and knew that he had been condemned to move from small ghettos to larger ones. Witnessing the drama of Negro progress elsewhere in the world, witnessing a level of conspicuous consumption at home exceeding anything in our history, it was natural that in 1963 Negroes would rise with the resolution and demand a share of the governing power and living conditions measured by American standards rather than by the standards of colonial impoverishment. An additional and decisive fact confronted the Negro and helped to bring him out of the houses into the streets, out of the trenches and into the front lines. This was the recognition that 100 years had passed since his emancipation, and no profound effect on his plight. With the dawn of 1963, plans were afoot all over the land to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation, the 100th birthday of the Negro's liberation from bondage. March. In Washington, a federal commission had been established to mark the event. Governors of states and mayors of cities had utilized the date to enhance their political image by naming commissions, receiving committees, issuing statements, planning state pageants, sponsoring dinners, endorsing social activities. Champagne this year would bubble on countless tables, appropriately attired, over thick cuts of roast beef. Uh, Legions would listen to the luminous phrases that were spun to salute the great dramatic landmark of which 1963 represented. But alas, all the talk and publicity accompanying the centennial only served to remind the Negro that he still wasn't free, that he still lived in a form of slavery disguised by certain niceties of complexity. As the then Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson phrased it, emancipation was a proclamation, but not a fact. The pen of the great emancipator had moved the Negro into the sunlight of physical freedom, but actual conditions had left him beyond or behind in the shadow of political, psychological, social, economic, and intellectual bondage. In the South, discrimination faced the Negro in its oblivious and glaring forms. In the North, it confronted him in hidden and subtle disguise. The Negro also had to recognize that 100 years after emancipation, he lived on a lonely island of economic insecurity in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. Negroes were still at the bottom of the economic ladder. They live within two concentric circles of segregation. One imprisons them in the basis of color, while the other confines them within a separate culture of poverty. The average Negro is born into want and deprivation. His struggle to escape his circumstances is hindered by color discrimination. He is deprived of normal education and normal social and economic opportunities. When he seeks opportunity, he is told, in effect, to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Advice which does not take into account the fact that he is barefoot. By 1963, most of America's working population had forgotten the Great Depression or had never known it. The slow and steady growth of unemployment had touched some of the white working force, but the proportion was still not more than 1 in 20. This was not true for the Negro. There were 2.5 times as many jobless Negroes as whites in 1963, and their median income was half that of the white man. Many white Americans of goodwill have never connected bigotry with economic exploitation. They have deplored prejudice, but tolerated or ignored economic injustice. But the Negro knows that these two evils have a malignant kinship. He knows this because he has worked in shops that employ him exclusively because the pay is below a living standard. He knows it is not an accident of geography that wage rates in the South are significantly lower than those in the North. He knows that the spotlight recently focused in on the growth in the number of women who work is not a phenomenon in Negro life. The average Negro woman has always had to work to help keep her family in food and clothes. To the Negro, as 1963 approached, the economic structure of society appeared to be ordered that a precise sifting of jobs took place. The lowest paid employment and the most tentative jobs were reserved for him. If he sought to change his position, he was walked in by the tall barrier of discrimination. As summer came more than ever, the spread of unemployment had visible and tangible dimensions to the colored American. Equality meant dignity, and dignity demanded a job that was secure and a paycheck that lasted throughout the week. The Negro's economic problem was compounded by the emergence and growth of automation. Since discrimination and lack of education confined him to unskilled and semi skilled labor, the Negro was and remains the first to suffer in these days of great technological development. The Negro knew all too well that there was not in existence the kind of vigorous retraining program that could really help him to grapple with the magnitude of his problem. The symbol of the job beyond the Great Wall was construction work. The Negro whose slave labor helped him build a nation was being told by the employers on the one hand and unions on the other that there was no place for him in this industry. Billions were being spent on city, state, and national building for which the Negro paid taxes but could draw no paycheck. No one who saw the spanning bridges, the grand mansions, the sturdy decks, and stout factories of the South could question the Negro's ability to build if he were given a chance for apprenticeship training. It was plain, hard, raw discrimination that shut him out of decent employment. In 1963, the Negro who had realized for many years that he was not truly free, awoke from a stupor of inaction and the cold dash of realization that 1963 meant 100 years after Lincoln gave his autograph to the cause of freedom. The milestone of the centennial of emancipation gave the Negro a reason to act, a reason so simple and obvious that he almost had to step back to see it. Simple logic made it painfully clear that if this centennial were to be meaningful, it must be observed not as a celebration, but rather as a commemoration of the one moment in this country's history when a bold, brave start had been made, and a rededication to the obvious fact that urgent business was at hand. The resumption of the noble journey toward the goals reflected in the preamble of the Constitution. The Constitution itself, the Bill of Rights, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Yet, not all of these forces conjoined could have brought about the massive and largely bloodless revolution of 1963 if there had not been a hand been at hand a philosophy and method worthy of its goals. Nonviolent direct action did not originate in America, but it found its natural home in this land, where refusal to cooperate with injustice was an ancient and honorable tradition, and where Christian forgiveness was written into the minds and hearts of good men. Tested in Montgomery during the winter of 1955 and 56, and toughened throughout the South in the 8 ensuing years. Nonviolent resistance has become, by 1963, the logical force in the greatest mass action crusade for freedom that has ever occurred in American history. Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon. It is a weapon unique in history, which cuts without wounding and ennobles the man who wields it. It is a sword that heals, both a practical and moral answer to the Negro's cry for justice. Nonviolent direct action proved that it could win victories without losing wars, and so became the triumphant tactic of the Negro Revolution of 1963. So, yeah, Dr. King talking a lot on how 63 became kind of a flashpoint. How all these uh, protests and everything came to the surface. And yet, while there was evil and disgust that also happened that year, it finally broke the surface and said, we're, we're going to fight this, but not violently. We will take direct action. And again, he showed this with the boycott in Birmingham, Alabama. Is it Birmingham or is the Montgomery bus boycott? My apology. Um, but yeah, basically when the African American citizens of Montgomery rose up and decided they would not ride the buses. They would make their way to their jobs, to their church, to their schools, to their grocery, if they had one in town. Uh, things were pretty bad back then. I'm sure they had a colored only grocery that tended to be the way of things. Separate but equal. There was no equal. It was just separate. But yeah. And he's explaining we cannot just sit here and go one issue at a time. Every issue must be tackled. It is not going to be an easy thing. But yeah, I'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.